Has anyone tried the 13th level ritual? I've always been fascinated by the darker corners of the internet. Not the dark web, just the less used websites and blogs. That's how I stumbled upon the 13th level ritual. It was just a post on a little-known forum, but it promised an experience beyond anything imaginable. A glimpse into a world that defied explanation, with the promise of good luck to those who follow the steps of the ritual correctly. I have saved the post, and although I will not link it here at this time, but the content of the post is as follows. Hello. Below you will find instructions on how to perform the 13th floor ritual. They say that if you perform the ritual correctly, you will have good luck, but at a price. Some people claim to have seen the other side, while others have disappeared without a trace. So who is brave enough to try? 1. Find a building with at least 13 floors. The building must have an elevator that can go to all floors without restrictions. 2. Begin the ritual at 1 a.m. This is 1 hour after midnight, also known as the true 13th hour. 3. Enter the elevator alone. If someone else gets in, you must wait and start again. 4. Press the buttons in ascending order, starting from 1 to 13, stopping at each floor. You must not continue if the elevator stops at any floor without pressing a button. 5. When you reach the 13th floor, the door will open to a hallway that does not exist in our world. You can see silhouettes in the distance. For no reason interact with them or show fear. 6. Leave something of personal significance in the hallway. The greater the meaning, the greater the luck. This is your offering. 7. Return to the elevator and do not return to the hallway. Press the first floor button. If the elevator starts going up, immediately press the button of any other floor to interrupt the process. 8. Exit the building immediately after reaching the first floor. Do not look back. Do not turn around. If you have passed the last step, congratulations. Now you can start experiencing good luck. You can also thank me later. Best regards. After reading this, I called my friend, whom I will call Steve in this story for the sake of anonymity. Steve and I have been together for a long time, and we both enjoy trying out strange rituals on the internet to document the results. It's a hobby we've shared since high school. Everything we've done before, unsurprisingly, has ended in disappointment, which is why it was no surprise that Steve initially turned down my invitation to join this special trip. No way, man. I don't think so. I mean, thanks for the offer, but Kristen's mom is coming from Vermont to visit this weekend, and she needs my help moving some stuff into her apartment. He told me. Plus, the post you sent said that only one person was allowed to perform the ritual, and nothing happened anyway. Of course nothing happened. I chuckled in response. But the fun is in the experience. Come on, man. There's no way I'm going to go into an old building at night by myself. Just take the stairs and meet me on each floor. I don't know. The furniture. Nobody moves furniture at night, Steve. You just don't want Kristen's mom to find out about your little hobby, right? Maybe. Steve sighed. I could hear the hesitation in his voice. Come on, Steve. We're both going to college in the fall. We have to have at least one last adventure before we get there. Man, Kristen really turned you into a scaredy cat. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Steve gave in. Okay, but if we get caught, I'll tell the police you took me hostage. Okay, I said with a triumphant smile. I'll pick you up at 11 tonight. We set out to find a building tall enough, old enough, and most importantly abandoned enough to hold the ceremony. It took longer than expected, and it was 12:40 when we decided which building to choose. After a bit of debate between Steve and I, we decided on the Markham building. It's an old, 18-story building, originally built in the 1930s when Art Deco architecture was all the rage. Today, it's largely empty, except for the first floor, which I believe is used as an insurance office in the morning. The rest of the building hasn't been rented since the 90s. We parked a few blocks away from the Markham building to avoid attracting unwanted attention. The street was eerily empty. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the rustling of bamboo leaves in the wind. As we approached the building, I couldn't help but feel nervous. The Markham building came into view. I imagined that it must have been one of the tallest, most stately buildings in the area at the time. But now it was ruined by years of neglect and decay. Steve and I had expected that getting into the building might be a bit difficult, as at least the first floor was still in use. But that didn't stop us from entering other similar locations in the past, although this would be the largest building we'd ever snuck into. We could see through the glass doors at the entrance that the first floor was still lit, so there was someone inside. I gently pushed the door open, and surprisingly it opened easily without any effort. Steve and I looked at each other with surprise, excitement, and worry. Steve quickly put the lockpick in his front pocket. We had been a little worried about being seen by any of the cameras inside, but now that the door was unlocked, we weren't too worried about being accused of trespassing, since as far as we knew, the building was still open. In fact, we were now more worried about running into an officer who might question us about what we were doing. Cautiously, we made our way through the entrance, past the empty reception desk, and into the main hall. It wasn't fancy. In fact, it was rather dark, and it also didn't look like it had been updated since the mid-80s when the building was last renovated. What stood out against this, however, was the large, shiny new silver elevator at the far end of the room. Half expecting someone to come up from behind, we hurried to the metal doors of the elevator. "Why is it so new?" Steve asked, holding the flashlight I had given him, even though it was useless at the moment. I had no idea. I shrugged. I guessed Wikipedia was wrong, and this place had been recently renovated. Well, maybe the other floors weren't even abandoned. Steve didn't reply, but I could easily see the worry on his face. The instructions were clear. At exactly 1 hour after midnight, I was to enter the elevator alone, go to the floors in a specific order, and never look back once the elevator reached the 13th floor under any circumstances. "Remember, you are to take the stairs and meet me at each floor," I reminded Steve. "Okay, I got it," he replied, his eyes darting toward the stairs. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the first floor. As the doors closed, I could hear Steve's faint footsteps as he headed for the stairs. The elevator began to rise, and as it did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced nervously into the mirror, half expecting to see a shadowy figure lurking behind me. But of course there was nothing. There was only the pale reflection of my house staring back at me. When the door finally opened on the first floor, I breathed a sigh of relief to see Steve standing there waiting for me. "Is everything okay?" he asked, a hint of concern in his voice. "Yeah, just a little scared," I admitted. "Let's keep going." I pressed the button for the second floor, the elevator doors closed, and the elevator continued its journey. We repeated this process, following the sequence of buttons outlined in the ritual. Each time the elevator stopped, I was greeted by Steve. He can always get to the next floor before me because the elevator takes about 20 seconds longer to open and close. I'm also careful never to step out or let him in. I don't want to do anything that might force us to start over. We continued floor by floor until I reached the 12th floor. When the door opened, I fully expected Steve to be there, as he had been on all the other floors. But no, just a dark, deserted office hallway. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. "Steve," I called softly, and as I did, the feeling of being watched intensified. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, and for a moment that stopped me from hearing anything else. Finally, I breathed a sigh of relief when I realized that I could hear Steve's footsteps echoing down the stairs. He must have started walking up to the 13th floor. I took a deep breath and pressed the button for the 13th floor. The elevator doors closed with a soft click. And even though I knew for sure that this ritual was just some idiot's online stunt, I still felt like I was using myself. To me, the ascent seemed slower this time, as if the elevator itself didn't want to reach its destination. When the door finally opened, I was greeted by pitch-black darkness. The other floors were dark, to be sure, but even then, there was a bit of light filtering through the large glass windows that lined some of the walls. My heart was pounding as I turned on my flashlight to see what lay ahead. Although I was scared, part of me was disappointed when all I saw was a hallway that looked completely normal for an abandoned building. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, and there was an old carpet on the floor. There were a few chairs and tables stacked in one corner, and a valley that seemed to be filled with paper, but other than that, there was nothing else of note in the hallway. It was eerily quiet. The only sound was the wet hum of the elevator behind me. I stepped out of the elevator. My heart had calmed down and was beating more evenly. I glanced around, hoping again to see Steve waiting for me, but the hallway was deserted. I cautiously took a few steps forward. My eyes scanned the area for any sign of movement. The air was heavy, and there was still the lingering, unmistakable feeling that something was watching me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my grandfather's old watch. He had given it to me as a birthday present before he died in a car accident. I had carried it with me as a sacrifice, hoping that its significance to me would be enough to satisfy whatever force was behind the good luck the forum poster had hinted at. I put the watch on the floor next to the trash can. I'll come back next weekend to pick it up, I told myself. When I turned back to the elevator, I froze in place. It was gone. The elevator was gone. I know this sounds crazy, and trust me, that's exactly how I felt at the time. But the elevator really did disappear. Instead, there was a blank wall, as if the elevator had never existed. Panic rose within me, and I turned around, searching for any sign of an exit. The hallway stretched out before me seemingly endlessly, with no exits or windows. "Steve," I called, my voice echoing through the empty hallway. There was no answer, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Steve," I yelled, louder this time. Still no response. I hesitated, trying to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I needed to think logically and come up with a plan. If the elevator was gone, then my only option was to find another way out. And that meant exploring the rest of the 13th floor. I hated the idea, but there was no other choice. I continued down the hallway, the flashlight really the only source of light. The air grew colder with every step, and the silence, for lack of a better word, was stifling, like it was trying to strangle me. I called out to Steve again, but there was no answer, just the echo of my own voice bouncing off the walls. A growing sense of dread, a sense that I was not alone. As I moved further, the hallway began to change. Faded wallpaper peeled away to reveal a layer of old, cracked plaster. The carpet crumbled underfoot, leaving a trail of dust and debris. Chairs that had been neatly arranged now lay scattered across the floor. And then I saw them, silhouettes of people. At first they were far away, barely more than silhouettes at the edge of my flashlight's reach. But as I drew closer, they became clearer. They were tall, impossibly thin, and completely still. I remembered the warning from the post. Do not interact with them or show fear. But how could I not be afraid? They were unlike anything I had ever seen, and their presence terrified me. I have never felt such intense fear in my life. I don't even know how to describe it exactly. Suddenly, I heard a scream, a desperate plea, and that voice was so familiar. "Help me." It was Steve's voice coming from somewhere up ahead. Without thinking, I started running towards the shadows and Steve's voice. I knew I was breaking the rules of protocol, but I didn't care. Steve was my friend, and he needed me. As I approached the figures, they turned to look at me. Their eye sockets looked like empty spaces, and the toothless mouths slowly opened wide, almost as if they were screaming. But they didn't make any sound. I reached out to them, begging for help. I don't know why I did it. It seems stupid now, but I was desperate, and probably in some kind of shock, to be honest. They didn't react. They just stood there, looking at me as Steve's crying grew fainter and fainter until it stopped altogether. Then I was alone again. There were shadows all around. I suddenly felt a sharp pain in my side, and I realized I had somehow injured myself. It felt like I had fallen on something sharp, but I knew that this had not happened until now. I rolled on the ground in pain for a moment as the figures silently watched me. My heart was pounding, but I was able to muster the strength to struggle to my feet. Even though the pain was excruciating, I had to get back to the elevator, had to escape this nightmare. I stumbled back the way I had come. The figures didn't block my way. In fact, they seemed to part to let me pass. When I got to where the elevator had been, to my surprise, it was still there, as if it had never gone away. Without hesitation, I pressed the button for the first floor and collapsed inside as the doors closed. Leaning against the wall, my energy was drained. That's when I felt the elevator start to go up. Panic hit me again. This wasn't right. The building was only 18 stories high, but it was already past the 30th floor and was still climbing and accelerating. I struggled to sit up and reach for the control panel. My vision opened. My fingers fumbled, but I pressed another button. I thought it was the first floor, but I could barely see, couldn't be sure. The elevator shuddered, then began to descend. When the elevator finally stopped, I braced myself for horror. But when the doors opened, it was indeed the first floor. Everything as before, except the lights were off. In a daze, I crawled out of the elevator, my body screaming in protest. I had to go out to get help, but I was so weak and exhausted that I thought I couldn't do it. I couldn't push the glass door to get out. And then, miraculously, a car drove by and saw me. A stranger ran to me, their voice echoing in the distance as they called for help. I woke up the next morning in the hospital. The sunlight streaming into the sterile white room was a welcome sight after the darkness of the Markham building. I sat up, feeling a sharp pain in my side. Lit looked around the room, wondering what had happened. The events of the night before seemed so far away that I began to believe that it must all have been a bad dream. Maybe I had been in a car accident. Just as I was beginning to convince myself of this story, I realized it. My grandfather's clock sat beside the bed. The hands were frozen at 1 o'clock, the actual 13th hour. My mind sank. Was it all true? How did the watch get there? What happened to Steve? I had to find out. Desperate for answers, I returned to the forum where I had found the ritual. I posted about my experiences, hoping someone could help me. The responses, though few, were a mix of skepticism and concern, but one message stood out. It was from a user named M, the same person who posted the ritual. "Congratulations," the comment read. "You have seen the other side. But remember that luck comes at a price. The figures you saw are now aware of you, and they will not rest until they get what they want. Be careful, and whatever you do not perform that ritual again." At that moment, I realized, with a sinking feeling, that Steve must have been the important thing I left behind on the 13th floor. I intended to leave my grandfather's watch behind, but somehow I accidentally left Steve behind. So this is the situation I'm in now. Obviously, I don't expect any of you to believe me. I don't even know if I fully believe it myself. I've tried calling Steve 100 times with no success. Kristen, Steve's girlfriend, kept texting me asking where he was. I didn't know how to make her believe this story. However, I knew I had to get back to that building. I had to do the ritual again. I couldn't leave Steve there. I had pushed him into this chaotic dream, and I had to be the one to get him out. The doctors say I have to stay in the hospital for at least a few more days, but I can't wait that long. I'm just waiting until 11 p.m. tonight, so I can squeeze out of here with enough time to get back to the Markham building by an hour. If any of you have any honest advice on what to do or how to get help, please let me know as soon as possible. I have only 13 hours left before I have to leave.